Thanks, Marian. Now it is a great privilege to me and a pleasure to present today's panelists. Marilyn Raphael is a Trinidadian professor of geography at UCLA and the director of UCLA Institute of Environment and Sustainability. Marilyn is a member of AAG Specialty Group and past president of AAG. Her primary research focused on Southern Hemisphere atmospheric dynamics and climate change, and her major scientific goals are to characterize the Antarctic sea ice variability and to define and understand the interaction between Antarctic sea ice and the large-scale Southern Hemisphere circulation. Her work includes global climate modeling with an emphasis on improving the simulation of sea ice and the atmosphere in the Southern Hemisphere. We also are going to be sharing this time with Stacy-ann Robinson, a Jamaican Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Dean of Global Engagement at Colby College. She's a member of AAG Caribbean Specialty Group and a former chair of the group. Stacy also contributed to the sixth assessment report of IPCC released in February 2022. Stacy primarily teaches international environmental policy and global climate policy. Her scholarship investigates the human, social, and policy dimensions of climate change adaptation in small island developing states, with a special focus on climate justice and adaptation finance. This event was coordinated as a conversation between participants. If you have a question for the panelists, you can write it on the chat or use the hand feature, and I will make sure the question is asked if there is time. Now, without further waiting, I would like to invite Marilyn and Stacy to share with us what brought them both to geography and how will they describe their work and main lines of research, as well as what motivates them to do the work that they do. Marilyn, can we start with you?
Sure. I was hoping you'd start, Stacy. So let me say first what brought me to geography. I think I've always been a geographer from the get-go. I have been eternally interested in the sky, the clouds, the rain, why it's raining here and not over there, and all of those things. And I found those in geography in my school. So I've been doing geography since I was 10 in one way or the other. But I also come from a family of geographers. My brothers, who both precede me in the, I'm junior to them, let's say, they are both geographers into university. And when I talk now with my mother and my father when he was here, I realize how much their perspective is geographic, and the things that I do now that they would have been were not able to pursue because they came up in a different time. There was so much geography built into it. So I guess it's kind of on my DNA. I went to primary school, secondary school, university, more university, and it has always been geography. I think Alex and I were talking some time ago and saying that we are really true blue geographers, 3-degree geographers in a way. Think of it that way. So yeah, that's that. I can't say it any more than that. For me, geography is really like the unifying science. It's where so many other things cannot be understood without an appreciation of their geography, how they're located. For me, this means how they're located in space and how that location in space has contributed to their being. I can stop there. Do you want me to talk about what I do? Or let Stacy go. Oh, well, what I do, I'm a physical geographer. I say a physical geographer, but that does not mean that I lack any understanding of human geography. All the way through until even in grad school, I did courses that were largely physical geography, but I was also interested in human geography as well. So I've always, like, I don't know, at the risk of sounding immodest, I'm like a real geographer. Like, I can appreciate both sides and what lies in the middle of them as well. Because I do not think of them as two separate things. I actually think there is a continuum, and sometimes that they're so closely woven together that the separate human from physical is like a false separation. Still, my focus is on physical geography, and there I am looking at what is happening in the Southern Hemisphere climate in terms of the climate dynamics, in terms of what is happening specifically with Antarctic sea ice, its variability in the long term, and in particular, what is happening right now. I think if you're paying any attention to the news, you'd have been bombarded by all the doom saying about what's happening with Antarctic sea ice. It's lower than ever, and there's no full understanding of what is happening. And the reason that it's important is that what's happening in Antarctica, quite like that other place, it doesn't actually stay there. It just makes its way across the equator into the Caribbean and places higher. So I look at how Antarctic sea ice varies in space and has varied in time, because understanding that variability, especially the spatial variability, gives us a deeper understanding of the climate. And especially in this day of climate change, understanding that and being able to predict what could happen should allow us to plan. I say should because that part is beyond me. That part is for the policymakers. It's part of me because I can vote, but it's for the policymakers who I vote into office. Yeah. Maybe I'll just stop there and let Stacy, because I think I've been rambling.
Well, thank you very much, Marilyn, for getting the ball rolling, and thanks to the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group for convening us, for this informal discussion that I'm very much looking forward to. So when I was trying to figure out, okay, how should I explain how I came to geography, I was going to start maybe 10 years ago, but because Marilyn took us all the way back, I think I want to just reflect a little bit, because there are so many things that came to mind when you were speaking, Marilyn. So I'll just walk you through just my encounters with geography. So I think, growing up as a child in Jamaica, my interest in geography was very much centered on maps and where countries are. So I remember my grandfather bought me an oversized collection of maps, and I used to just sit down and go through, from continent to continent. Didn't know anything about the countries, but it just really opened my eyes to the world out there. Mm-hmm. So I think that has stuck with me, that kind of interest. And I think, a few years after that, he bought me a globe. So I think he was already planting, many seeds that.
This is a FEMA test.
Oh, okay. I was shocked.
Everybody should be experiencing something like it. Yeah, it's done.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks for the heads up, Marilyn. Yeah, so as I started to say, he bought me a globe a few years after. So there was already, these seeds being planted about the world being, bigger than you, bigger than your family, bigger than Jamaica. But I think for me, in terms of the formal education system in geography, and it's something that we could probably talk about a little bit more later, is that the structure of our curriculum made a choice for me. So, in high school, I was also interested in history. I was also interested in social studies, but the high school that I went to actually had these subjects against each other. So, it was a choice between geography and history. It was a choice between geography and social studies. So I think that could deserve some attention as well from the policymakers, as you're saying, Marilyn. So I think I got to a point where geography was up against history, and I chose history over geography. And I think a part of that was also a mild intimidation of physical geography, because once you got to advanced geography, you had to pay equal attention to, the physical geography as well as the human geography. And I think at that time, I found it a little bit intimidating. So because of that, I went on to UA and I majored in international relations and political science. Then did my master's at the University of Manchester, which was international development, with a focus on environment and development. And I think this is where I can say I'm a bit of a born-again geographer, because how I would describe my work right now is at the intersection of political geography and development geography. So when I look back at my academic journey, I can really see, the foundation that was laid in terms of international relations and political science at UA being reflected in my work now. The foundations that were laid at Manchester in terms of international development really reflecting in my work now. And, as I progress, I've also been able to, incorporate, Caribbean geography. So I'm very much at the intersection of a few things. And I'm coming from that perspective in terms of studying climate change adaptation in small island developing states. So I not only study the islands in the Caribbean, I also study the islands in the Pacific and the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. But going forward, I do want to, pay more attention to Caribbean geography, because I think it just has a calling on my life. There are so many, experiences that I've observed that, I'd want to understand better from a research perspective. I see lots of gaps that need to be filled. So the work continues. So I'll stop right there. Just generally, that's the kind of work that I do.
I want to jump in and say, when you were talking about maps when you were a child, we had exactly the same experience. The atlas and the dictionary, those were the two dirtiest books in the house, because those were the two that we were using all of the time. We used to play games, to find different countries and make up stories about them. So it really is from childhood. Yeah. And the thing about your having to choose in school which subjects, and they were up against each other. But it's interesting that I had the same experience, because we did for GCEs, but I had geography and history, and I thought to myself, I'm going to do geography because I can read history. So I realized later on that, like, history, I mean, history has always been interesting, but because of that, I have less of a grasp of the importance of history compared to what I have of geography. And it's an unfortunate thing, I think. But yeah, those early choices are really, really pivotal.
Can I just jump back in? Is this how it's supposed to go? Yeah, Marilyn, I also wanted to follow up on something that you said, because part of me describing myself, just in this context, it came to me as a sort of born-again geographer, is I think I also found a home in geography, and this is thinking about, geography as an academic discipline. And, the way that I've described it typically is geography is probably the truest integrative science. Like, yes. If you want to understand that problem, taking a lens such as, the ones that we're exposed to, I think that is where we'll find the solutions. I think there is a set of incredible opportunities right now in our discipline to apply what we know to these very critical problems, such as, climate change, and to see how we can make a contribution to society just by using our discipline.
No, I completely agree with that. The problems that we're facing, they are the integration of all kinds of action. And for us to approach solution, we have to be able to see, to take an integrative approach to solution. Now that sounds like a lot of big words. I can't boil it down any smaller, but you know what I mean. You have to understand there's not just one cause, and it's not just another cause, and it's not just the two causes. It's actually how they work together, and the geographical perspective allows us to see that, and we have to start from there in order to achieve a solution, I think. So I agree.
Yeah, I don't know if folks have been following like these Twitter developments in terms of what's happening in political science, with APSA and, crossing the picket lines and, the developments in sociology. But, there's been no drama in geography. And I think that's also an opportunity. So not only is our discipline integrative, and not only is it inclusive, but we're actually ahead of the curve on many of these things. So I think my perspective of geography is that it's also very progressive. And I think we need to tap into that potential and tap into that power a little bit more.
I think it is interesting to see how both agree in terms of the need of an integrated approach for geography and the relevance of see these complex issues as issues that needs multiple approaches, and use all the features and all the opportunities that geography offers to do that. And I would like to ask you both, why should we be talking about the Caribbean geographies specifically today, and why it is essential to create spaces and discussions of the region in the context of global climate change?
You want me to go first, Marilyn?
Yeah, I think I would like that. I have some ideas, but I think I'd like to hear you go first. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about something that's top of mind, and here's a shameless plug. But April Baptiste and April is at Colgate. She's also a member of the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group. We just finished an editorial for a special issue on environmental justice in the Caribbean for the Geographical Journal, and that just went online yesterday, right? So one of the arguments that we tried to make in the editorial is that the Caribbean has contributed so much to how we understand, Western civilization. It has contributed to the creation of Western civilization, but somehow it's been marginalized in terms of certain specific discourses. And one of them is environmental justice. So for those of you on the call, that are familiar with the evolution of environmental justice, the environmental justice movement, you'll hear that, this is something that started in the US. There's almost, a very sophisticated scholarship based on the US experience that includes issues related to race, issues related to class and social stratification. And, the theory of environmental justice based on the US is pretty advanced. But, our argument is based on that contribution that the Caribbean makes to the world. We haven't really paid attention to, the EJ struggle, environmental justice struggles in the region. We haven't had, a serious documentation of those struggles and how, Caribbean people have resisted, especially if we're thinking about our experience and history with, slavery, colonialism, etc. So I think like that, in terms of trying to understand environmental justice in the context of the Caribbean, my feeling is that there are other such opportunities where we just haven't had the time or the space to focus on, the experience of the Caribbean and the contributions of the Caribbean to certain discourses. So I think that's one of the things that came out of doing, that special issue. And, within that, there are also a lot of, other areas that haven't gotten the attention that they deserve. And I'm thinking particularly about one paper in the special issue by Adele Thomas and Lisa Benjamin that looks at the experience of Haitian migrants in Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian in 2019. And one of the points that they make in the paper is that sometimes we're just focused on, you know, the oppression that Caribbean people face from colonial powers, you know, like the European powers, and we're not paying attention to the oppression that Caribbean people face within their own countries that's imposed from their own governments. So I think that's also interesting, and we can think of other experiences, not just, you know, the Haitian experience in the Bahamas. We can also think of the Haitian experience in the Dominican Republic. And another great example is always Puerto Rico and the experience with the congressional government in DC. So I think there are more contributions that we can make, but there's so much that we can gain from centering the Caribbean in some of these mainstream discourses.
I just learned an awful lot from what you were saying there, because I'm tying it into some other things I know. Because my work focuses on physical geography, it is sometimes difficult to pull what I do into talking about environmental justice, for example. And in this, I'm learning of ways to do that, but specifically thinking of something like environmental justice in the Caribbean, it doesn't actually lend itself like immediately to that kind of discussion. But what Stacy said there made me think as well that when we're talking about Caribbean geographies and the contribution of the Caribbean, sometimes I think, okay, I have to remember the Caribbean is not just Trinidad and Tobago, it's a whole wider area. I really have to remind myself of that sometimes. But also, when a question is posed like that, I'm immediately starting to think of the Caribbean in the Caribbean and not recognizing the contribution that so many Caribbean people are doing outside of the Caribbean. For example, an example right here is ourselves, where we're practicing not in the Caribbean, but there is a Caribbean slant. There's a Caribbean, we brought that way of thinking to wherever we are and whatever we're doing. And that's important to be acknowledged, I think.
Well, if I could just add a point, right, about Trinidad not being the whole Caribbean, you know, Jamaicans get accused of the same thing. You know, they always say, you know, those Jamaicans think that Jamaica is the whole Caribbean. But another thing that came out of the special issue that April and I coordinated was that there are really some gaps in terms of the countries that get attention. And that came to mind, you know, based on what you just shared, Marilyn. And sometimes it's a result of just function and feasibility. But, you know, the larger islands tend to get more attention and more scholarly attention. So the Jamaicas, you know, the Trinidads, Haiti, probably for some other reasons. But even if we're considering environmental justice scholarship, some of the smaller countries are often marginalized in the discourse as well. So I would say one of the things that I would try to encourage folks to do if they're interested in this line of work is, you know, pay some attention to some of the smaller countries, right? And I see Erin Friedman on the call, and in the editorial, we also cited, you know, the work that she's doing in Antigua. And I think that's a great case study, but some of those smaller islands in the Lesser Antilles. Of course, this has implications for like budgets and things like that. But I think, you know, we're all brilliant people, so we can come together and figure out how to, you know, it's also data justice as well, right? How we can deliver data justice to some of those smaller islands in the region.
Yeah, just to add, because they're smaller, and that often means they have a smaller voice. It means that they get left out, and we have to pay attention to that, which I think is part of what you're saying. On the environmental justice peg as well, because by not including them, that is a negative act. That is injustice, and they have is probably just a matter of scale because they're smaller, but they have the same issues. And I argue with my friends that Barbados is actually sitting in the Atlantic, but I do pull it into the Caribbean discussion, and because that's where all the political and social and connective ties are. The Barbadian Prime Minister is a force.
Well, I'll say, Marilyn, you're throwing stones, about Barbados being in the Atlantic. But
no, that was meant in jest. It is really true. But
it is. No complaints there.
But it is in my mind, it is Caribbean, West Indies, all of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I'd add to Marilyn's point about Trinidad is, one of the arguments that we can make about centering the Caribbean is it's almost like a natural lab, right? One of the arguments that we try to emphasize, in the kind of work that I do in terms of small island states and the Caribbean and climate change is that, even though countries face similar vulnerabilities, there's lots of disparities, lots of variability, at a national scale, at the local scale. And I thought about this point with Trinidad, because there's lots of interesting research in terms of, sea level rise at different, at opposite points of the island. So I think there are other cases that can help to demonstrate some of those larger points that we're making, on the global scale, like Prime Minister Motley and others have, put the force of their voice behind. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
So you mentioned sea level rise, and that gives me the opportunity because it is the only thing that I've thought of that my work has an actual bearing on, and that is the melting of ice from the continent of Antarctica leads directly to global sea level rise. So there's a direct connection between what happens there physically and what happens in countries like Trinidad and Tobago, especially the island of Trinidad and other low-lying islands in the Caribbean. And sea level rise is one thing. And then the other thing that's really important, as one of my colleagues, Roger Pulwarty, who's also a Trinidadian, you might know his name, and I think he's also a geographer. But he, the problem of saltwater intrusion. So even if the sea level isn't rising, so that you can see the saltwater intrusion that comes along with sea level rise, poses a huge problem for the fertility of the islands. And it's not a reversible problem like in the near future. So you can also take that and tie that into environmental justice, because here we're looking at a smaller island. People there have contributed so little to the problem that we're now facing, but they are bearing in some instances the brunt of the effects. I mean, people still live on Trinidad. People still live on the other islands of the Caribbean, the ones that the hurricanes haven't taken out. Let me just point that out, and that's also associated with the work that I do. But there are islands in the South Pacific where people aren't living there anymore because of global sea level rise. Yeah.
Well, one thing that I add as well is that a part of me feels like a big part of my research is making interventions, like pointing out things that I think are really important that might have been forgotten. And just to build on Marilyn's point about sea level rise and hurricanes, a couple weeks ago, I gave a talk at an insurance conference. And one of the points that I tried to make was that even though we're focused on rapid onset events, we can't lose sight of the effects of slow onset events, such as, or slow onset processes, such as sea level rise. So I think that's another consideration for Caribbean geographers, you know, the rapid onset, the extreme weather events, the Hurricane Dorians, the Hurricane Marias, Irmas, Harveys, etc., get lots of attention, and it's for a good reason, right? But while we're paying attention to the rapid onset events, we can't lose sight of the potential impact of slow onset processes. Well, in the bigger scheme of things, are likely to have a much more devastating impact on the geography of the Caribbean, including, you know, cultural survivability and human survivability more generally. So I think that's also an area that we can make a big impact on as Caribbean geographers, paying attention to some of those processes, some of those impacts that might not be getting the scholarly or the media attention that's deserved.
I think that point is very, very interesting, how we focus not only on the big hazards, but also on the slow things that are happening day by day and are affecting the quality of life of people, that sometimes are things that people see on their everyday, but might not be pointed in the international sphere. And I would like to ask, you both are working on very technical things in terms of ice melting and physical aspects, but also in policy. How can we make knowledge more accessible to those that are in the front line in the Caribbean, so they can take advantage, or they can create their arguments, or take the position they would like to take? How can we make knowledge more accessible to them as a contribution from outside for those that still living in the Caribbean?
That's not so easy to answer, I think. Well, there are direct ways, as in philanthropic ways, where a thing I used to do, I don't do it anymore, I have to think about another way to do it, is directly helping like schools with computers, books, etc. But I think you're asking about something else. And one of the things that I do is making this stuff that I write open access, so that they don't have a paywall if they want to read about it. And not just what I do for my personal research, but I also have involvements with other groups, making sure that they are open to doing things like open access, to doing things like publishing their data where people can have it. But we're also assisted in this by the journals in which we publish. So I can't say that it's just like my work and I'm like the pioneer in doing it. That's how the space in which I move, that's their MO right now. I can't think of anything else right in this moment, but let Stacy and I'll churn as she talks.
So again, this special issue on environmental justice in the Caribbean. There's a great article in the collection by Roy Kirby-Straker. And one of the things that they talk about is knowledge repatriation. So in addition to the point that Marilyn just made about trying, to publish as many of the things that we can open access, part of that is also recognizing that the cost is a barrier as well. I mean, some of these fees can range from nothing to $12,000 US, right? Depending on the journal. So it can be really prohibitive. But, you know, back to Roy's paper, one of the things that it called for is really challenging or ideas of the organizations and institutions that we see as worthy and viable research partners in the region. So I think a part of that as well is seeing how we can strengthen our collaborations with the University of the West Indies, for example, or particular departments or units across the university system, such as CERMES, for example, in Barbados. But, you know, just thinking about something that Marilyn said, I mean, how do we get back the knowledge to the community? I think that's something that even I personally can do more of, you know, when you work with local communities, how, you know, we engage them with the findings of our research. But I think we really have to be deliberate about it. You know, it won't happen organically. And a part of that is perhaps building that into our research design, thinking intentionally about how to give back that knowledge. But I think collaborations are the key, right? And drawing on, you know, that paper from the special issue about, you know, how do we elevate the profile of regional institutions, organizations, or units to let them be viewed as viable research partners, I think has lots of merits to it as well.
Stacy was talking, it just occurred to me that one of the things that the question did is it made me think, how am I doing it? And I realized that there are things that I do that are not me doing it, but the institutions within which I work do it, and I can encourage from in there. So for instance, I and I think this could be an example of what you're talking about. I direct the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, and one project which we just finished working with in the Caribbean was with the University of the West Indies on resilience, so climate resilience. And what I was able to do directly is make it so that a student from the Institute would work with the UE group to help them with their web page and several other projects that they had going. I can't remember the detail. I was just excited to set it up and let it go. And the student did make a fine contribution in the end. So things like that, where you see the opportunity to contribute from the larger institution to the to something that in this case, an institution in the Caribbean is working on to a good end. That's one way in which to do it, and it's something that I'm always on the lookout for. So now we have established a relationship, and we can build on that, and we're looking towards that.
Well, if I can just add, Bárbara, I know your question had like a policy dimension, and I'm very much motivated by Marilyn to say specifically what do I do? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I try to do is to develop like these very short policy briefs based on research papers that I've done. I don't always have the time, but you know, when I do, I think it's useful. And this is just like a 2-pager back and front with a couple, you know, interesting probably graphs from the manuscript or some photos illustrating the problem, and sending these out to not only like government officials in the countries that are probably studied in the manuscript, but also, you know, fellow professors working on similar issues. When I do have students in my lab, in quotes, that's an activity I get them involved with, because I think writing policy briefs is a really valuable tool that students can take forward with them as well.
Thank you. I think that question was important to me to make it, because sometimes we think on knowledge mobilization as a way of also give justice to the Caribbean, all of these scholars outside. How can we still contributing even when we are living in other places? So it's very interesting what you both raised about it. And I will also like to ask, how can we think about justice in the context of the Caribbean? We talk already about knowledge, but other aspects in which we can contribute to that. And I think it would be interesting to talk about that.
When you say justice, you mean environmental justice or justice broadly?
I'm thinking environmental justice, but if you have more comments related also to climate justice and other social justice and other aspects, you can also elaborate on that.
Stacy, you go.
Well, one of the things that we've realized is when we're looking at the scholarship related to environmental justice in the Caribbean, most of it, though there's not a lot, and it is dominated by discussions of climate justice. Now, that might be totally rational, but climate change is not the only challenge we're facing in the Caribbean. And I think for me personally, that's why the advocacy work of Prime Minister Motley is so fascinating, because I'm not going to repeat it, but Barbados is very far east, and it's very far east, and its exposure to hurricanes is very small considering other Caribbean islands in the Hurricane Alley. So it's interesting to me that Prime Minister Motley has angled the call for justice, not necessarily focused on climate change, but focused on debt, which I think is quite interesting if I haven't said that yet. So I think this focus on debt justice can be linked to climate justice, but it has a very prominent position that it can occupy in discussions of environmental justice and even broader justice claims in the region. So I expect that a lot of momentum will be built around debt justice, and there are quite a few Caribbean geographers working actively right now trying to highlight the disparities. Haiti is a good example of that, its relationship with France, and just how extractive that relationship has been and increasing its present day vulnerability. But if we're to step back from that, debt is actually also quite interesting in a number of ways, because depending on the Caribbean country, in some cases, you'll find that most of the debt is actually domestic, right? So it's owed to private sector companies, private individuals, etc. So it goes back to that earlier point I made about the point that, Thomas and Benjamin made in their paper. Is there a space for us to focus on injustice within the country, right? So there is this global conversation that we can have about debt, the historical relationship between, a colonizer and a colonized country. But what about those relationships when we're talking about national governments to private enterprise and the implications that that can have for Caribbean societies, just generally?
I'll say two things, because I'm getting my ideas from you. Thank you. The two things is, and this is probably where the debt is external, is that debt justice, if justice were served, would mean that the countries involved might have the resources to be more resilient, become more resilient to the effects of climate change. So I can see that there's a link in there. Unfortunate, but that's what it what I can see. The other thing I think is, yes, we focus a lot on the colonizers and their contribution to their extractive approach to the countries that they colonized. But what they also did that contributes to the internal, that is they left structures in place that, to me, and this, I'm saying this as I'm thinking it. So you might have to, process it some more. But they've left structures in place, and they've left ways of thinking in place that, to me, make it's an echo of the external extraction process. And we have to figure out ways to get past that as well. Did that make sense?
Can I just add something as well? It came to mind as Marilyn was speaking. Another dimension, I think, is what to do about Guyana and its oil exploration. And this is inherently a justice discussion, at least from my perspective, right? Because here it is, we have countries, such as the US, those in Europe, for example, having benefited from 300 years of extraction, not just oil, but other things as well, based on, the contribution we just heard from Marilyn. So now that Guyana has found, a considerable amount of oil, what should they be allowed to do, right? Or what shouldn't they be allowed to do? I think that's a question that we should start not necessarily answering, but having like a robust discussion about, but within the context of justice in the Caribbean.
You mean, what should Guyana be allowed to do?
Or not do?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is, when we're talking to the Guyanese, we not want to say aloud. What did we advise them to do or not do? And I'm smiling as I say it, but it makes a difference in immediately how people will listen or not to whatever you have to say. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you saw that interview recently on British television. That was a little bit hard to watch in terms of just the reaction to calls for reparations, being made by the Guyanese government and Guyanese people. But, I'm coming at it from the perspective of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, where we're at the point in the climate negotiations where countries are being asked to say what their commitments are in terms of, greenhouse gas targets and commitments. Guyana being a part of the Alliance of Small Island States, their argument is we should be able to extract for oil because we're behind the development curve. But, colleagues and coalitions that are based in the global north are saying, well, it's sort of the ignorance challenge. Now that we know the impact of oil extraction, we shouldn't be authorizing, allowing Marilyn with an asterisk beside it, these sorts of extractive operations because we know the negative environmental implications. But for me, it's a fairness argument all the way through.
So here's what this is probably not going to happen, but here's what I think should happen is Guyana has found huge reserves. Guyana is, and these are not my words, but I'll use it because everybody will understand what it means. The developmentally behind in a lot of ways, and the money from this oil could be a huge help So now that the other world has gotten rich and done the extraction and done the damage, what they should do is say, okay, here's how we can help you so that you do not extract that oil. They shouldn't say, don't extract that oil and use it because it creates, it will worsen the climate. They should be saying, here's what we can do to help. Otherwise, the argument is a little bit empty. It's more like, we are here now and you can't get here because it's bad. It's just unfair. And Guyana is front and center because it is part of our region that we're talking about. But there are other countries in the world that are using like bad coal, or using coal and using other fossil fuels that emit a lot into the atmosphere. And they are poorer countries. We can't tell them to just stop. Oh, we can, but we shouldn't just tell them to stop. We should say, here's this instead to achieve the same ends. And should we share from the gain that we've had? I think, and that's fair.
But also, this is not to say as well that there aren't countries that are much richer than Ghana that are rapidly building out their fossil fuel infrastructure.
Yeah, well, they should stop.
So we just want to make sure we have, all the factors in consideration when, we're talking about Ghana as well, because that's one of the things that the war in Ukraine has really amplified, considering tensions with Russia. There's certain European countries that are expanding their fossil fuel infrastructure right as we speak.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for those ideas regarding justice. I think one of the points in common we have is that geography offers us the space to explore all of these complex issues and provide an integrated approach. And also that there is a space even for the people that is not living in the Caribbean but have connections and interests to contribute even from outside to the things that are happening there. And being mindful of the time, I would like to ask one last question that is going to be very short, but because there is students here and probably young scholars and people interested in the Caribbean, I would like to ask, what advice would you give to those students and people's interested in the Caribbean doing work there? What kind of advice can you give them at the moment of conducting research on the Caribbean? Or if there is any line of research that you find very interesting and needs more work, any kind of suggestion will be more than welcome.
When I hear that question, my first response is, if you're doing work in the Caribbean, continue to do it and do it well, because I'm sure it is work well worth doing. To be able to say something that's more stimulating or relevant to the student, I probably need to know what it is they're doing, so that I can say, okay, here is where that fits in this larger space that I see, and here is what you can do, etc. with it. I'd really need to know. What I can say that will apply is that I'm confident that it's work well worth doing, and just look for ways in which you can place that work, and look for people, reach out to people like people in this room, to make your connections, to establish yourself. I think the very fact that people are in this room, and maybe I'm speaking for myself only, but I'll speak for everybody else too, means that we're willing to get requests from you, to have access to even further discussions. Like, I'm pretty happy to be able to talk with anybody who's doing work in the Caribbean, and you think that you want to ask a question, maybe I can help. I mightn't help answer the question that you're doing, but helping establish connections where you can move, then I can do that. I think it's your turn, Stacy.
Recently I met a group of students with an interest in the Caribbean, and it turns out that they hadn't lived in the Caribbean, but their parents were from the Caribbean or their grandparents. And I think what I left the meeting with was somehow they weren't confident that the connection that they had to the Caribbean was strong enough or would justify, working on the Caribbean. So I think, part of my parting message to them was that, no, the interest is there, the heritage is there. So there is a place for you in Caribbean geography. So I think if there's anybody on the call in that kind of situation where you weren't born in the Caribbean, but you're of Caribbean heritage, I think you need to, take that to heart and use it as a source of motivation to say, I have something to say, I can contribute to the discussions in a very positive way. For me, some of the emerging areas that I think are quite fascinating include, disaster capitalism or racial capitalism, or the role of history and colonialism in amplifying or increasing environmental vulnerability. I think those are promising. But one of the things I'm noticing as well is there isn't a lot of work on historical disasters in the Caribbean that are, that would be available, in mainstream media and mainstream journals. I think that could be one of the areas of focus. How do we elevate the voice of Caribbean geography in academic scholarship generally? And I think everybody on this call has an opportunity to make a contribution there.
There's something you said earlier, and I probably won't say it as nicely as you put it, but the Caribbean is like a lab, and there are so many interesting questions there that Caribbean, but also have, you didn't say global, but I'm going to say have global reach. So think about those as you do it. And they include some of what you've mentioned there, Stacy.
Well, thank you so much to Marilyn and Stacy-ann both for all of those ideas, for being able to share this time with us, to have this informal but very strong conversation about Caribbean issues. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first of a series of panels that it is with the purpose of connecting people that is from the Caribbean or is doing work on the Caribbean, to make stronger connections, to create spaces for discussion, to create spaces in which students can reach people that can support them on their work. So we are very, very much grateful for having you both here. And also, I would like to say thank you to all the people who attend today. We are working on recording this conversation and thinking on ways of sharing it for other people that wasn't able to attend. And also, I would like to say that there is a survey on the chat that is thinking also on gathering some information to make stronger the committee, to have some insights from the people that is part of the Caribbean Geography Specialty Group. So if you can complete the survey, we will appreciate it a lot. And also just keep an eye on your emails. We are going to be sharing information about other conversations. We are mindful that we have very strong topics here, like justice and other topics, knowledge mobilization, and probably more time will be great to do that. So we will keep that in mind. But for now, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Marilyn. And we hope we can keep going these conversations in the future, and we can do great work in the Caribbean. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you so much to the panelists.
Thank you.
Perhaps it's worth saying we're going to pause the recording here, but if folks want to hang around and talk, lime in Caribbean style, that's allowed.